achievements and talents beyond the limit, moving forward to our big dreams. Thirst for knowledge through complete individual elaboration. Perform plenty of things with visible learning method. Also provide qualified teachings in facing the professional world through adaptation of the latest technology. We will continuously produce the certified associate degree and applied bachelor who professionally responding to the industrial needs of today and the future. There is no innovation without collaborations. By developing trust and convincing every high dream, through synergies in several world-class companies, we are confident to move forward to better and higher achievements. This is our progressing pace as the agent of change. Because every step we take raises the spirit of sustainability for our country and nation. We are the vocational education program of Universitas Indonesia. We are present as a strong vocational education that strengthens Indonesia.
Terdengar suaranya.
Cek, tes 1 2 3 cek tes cek tes masih kecil, suaranya masih kecil. Tes 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 tes.
Halo, yuk. Potong.
darurat yang telah tersedia di sebelah kanan dan di sebelah kiri di dalam ruangan ini. Emergency doors are in the right side and the left side of the buildings. Keluarlah menuju titik berkumpul. Go out in the light to the assembly point. Silahkan berikan prioritas kepada ibu hamil, penyandang disabilitas, dan lansia. Please give priorities for pregnant women, the elderly, and disabilities to go out first. Di bagian koridor gedung ini telah tersedia alat pemadam api ringan atau APA, dan di luar gedung ini telah tersedia selang hydrant. The fire extinguisher will easily find in the corridor, and there is a water hydrant outside the building. Terima kasih, thank you.
Thousands of villages are started from small footsteps, the steps that will never stop walking towards their dream. The dream that never ends to be fulfilled. A degree is an achievement. Work readiness.
Perjalanan ribuan mil dimulai dari langkah kecil sang kaki. Langkah yang tak pernah berhenti meraih mimpi. Mimpi yang tak pernah usai ingin diwujudkan. Gelar merupakan satu pencapaian. Siap kerja tak hanya dibuktikan dengan kelulusan, namun kompetensilah yang menjawab semuanya. Sejatinya pendidikan bukan hanya membangun badannya, tetapi harus mampu membangun jiwanya. Dan kami mempersiapkan hari ini sebaik-baiknya untuk menguatkan sumber daya manusia unggul yang sanggup menghadapi tantangan global melalui kompetensi vokasional. Kita bergerak bersama sebagai derma pengetahuan yang tinggi di Indonesia dan ditopang oleh mereka yang berani mengambil langkah. Langkah yang tak pernah terfikirkan untuk berhenti. Dan kami selalu ada untuk setiap transformasi. Meningkatkan pengetahuan dan teknologi terapan yang bermanfaat bagi bangsa adalah visi kami. Dengan cipta karya yang bergema di setiap pengejawantahan karakter dan ketekunan, kami menopang setiap individu untuk menggali prestasi dan talenta hingga menembus batas. Melangkah maju menuju impian yang tegas. Kehausan meraih ilmu dengan mengelaborasi individu secara utuh. Melakukan banyak hal dengan menggunakan metode pembelajaran secara nyata, serta memberikan pengajaran yang siap menghadapi dunia kerja. Dengan mengadaptasi teknologi terkini, kami akan terus melahirkan ahli madya, serta sarjana terapan yang tersertifikasi kompetensi profesi untuk menjawab kebutuhan industri saat ini dan masa yang akan datang. ada inovasi yang tercipta tanpa kolaborasi. Dengan membangun rasa percaya dan meyakinkan setiap mimpi yang tercipta tinggi, dengan sinergi di berbagai perusahaan kelas dunia, tak ada nada ragu untuk kami terus melangkah maju hingga mencapai lebih tinggi, menjadi yang terbaik. Ini langkah kami untuk terus maju menjadi agen perubahan. Karena setiap langkah yang kami lakukan terbangun semangat keberlangsungan bagi bangsa dan negara. Kami adalah program pendidikan vokasi Universitas Indonesia. Hadir sebagai pendidikan vokasi yang kuat menguatkan Indonesia.
Thousands of marriages are started from small footsteps. Footsteps that will never stop walking towards their dream. The dream that never ends to be fulfilled.
dan kebaikan untuk kita semua.
Greetings of welfare and harmony to us all.
Kami ucapkan selamat datang kepada Profesor Louise Curham selaku pembicara kuliah umum kita pada hari ini.
We extend a warm welcome to Professor Louise Curham as the keynote speaker for our public lecture today.
Yang terhormat kepada Bapak Denny Daniel Kesa, MBA PhD, selaku Wakil Direktur Bidang Pendidikan, Penelitian, dan Kemahasiswaan.
Dear Mr. Denny Daniel Kesa, MBA PhD, Esteemed Vice Director of Education,
Yang terhormat Fitri selaku
Dear Mrs. Dia Savitri, SEP MHUM, Esteemed Secretary,
terhormat Ibu Wiwit Mardiati SSMIM selaku Ketua Program Studi Manajemen Rekod dan Arsip.
Dear Mrs. Wiwit Mardiati SSMEM, Esteemed Chairperson of the Archive and Record Management Program.
Yang terhormat Bapak Dr. Budiman Mahmud Mustafa, SOS MSI selaku Ketua Departemen Sosial Humaniora Terapan.
Dear Mr. Dr. Budiman Mahmud Mustafa, SOS MSI, esteemed the head of the Social Humanities Department.
Dan yang terhormat jajaran dosen Program Studi Manajemen Rekod dan Arsip.
And dear all lecturers of the Archive and Record Management Program.
Kami ucapkan selamat datang kepada Bapak Wahid Noviantara selaku Kepala Kantor Arsip Universitas Indonesia.
We extend a warm welcome to Mr. Wahid Noviantara, esteemed Head Office of Archive Universitas Indonesia.
Kami ucapkan selamat datang kepada Bapak Cendi Triawan Nugraha selaku perwakilan dari Dinas Kebudayaan Provinsi DKI Jakarta.
We extend a warm welcome to Mr. Cendi Triawan Nugraha, esteemed the representative of Culture Department of DKI Jakarta Province.
Kami ucapkan selamat datang bagi Ikatan Sarjana Ilmu Perpustakaan dan Informasi, Asosiasi Perguruan Tinggi Pengelolaan Arsip dan Rekaman Informasi Indonesia, dan Perkumpulan Provisi Pengelola Rekod Indonesia.
We extend a warm welcome to Ikatan Sarjana Ilmu Perpustakaan dan Informasi, Asosiasi Perguruan Tinggi Pengelolaan Arsip dan Rekaman Informasi Indonesia, also Perkumpulan Profesi Pengelola Rekod Indonesia.
Dan kami ucapkan selamat datang kepada para hadirin yang hadir di Auditorium Vokasi maupun yang hadir melalui platform Zoom.
Additionally, we would like to extend a warm welcome to all attendees present in the auditorium and those joining us via Zoom platform.
Kami memberi himbauan jika nanti ada pertanyaan bagi yang hadir melalui Zoom, maka bisa ditanyakan lewat kolom chat Zoom.
We would like to tell that if there are any questions from those attending via Zoom, you can ask through chat on Zoom.
Selamat pagi semua, perkenalkan saya Fadilah Kemala.
Saya Tristan Tira Kaladindadin,
selaku MC pada kuliah umum yang bertemakan Archive as Cultural Heritage and the Power of Remembering, bersama Profesor Louise Curham dari Curtin University.
Good morning everyone, let us introduce ourselves. I'm Tristan Tira Kaladindadin,
and I'm Fadilah Kemala,
as the Master of Ceremonies for this public lecture with the theme Archives as Cultural Heritage and the Power of Remembering, featuring Professor Louise Curham from Curtin University.
Sebelum memulai acara, alangkah baiknya kita berdoa.
Before we begin, it is good for us to pray.
Berdoa dimulai.
Prayers begin.
Berdoa selesai.
Prayers end.
Para hadirin yang terhormat dimohon untuk berdiri dan menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya.
Dear attendees, please stand up in order to sing Indonesia's national anthem.
Para hadirin dimohon duduk kembali.
Attendees may now take their seats.
Berikutnya, kita akan mendengarkan sambutan dari Bapak Denny Daniel Kesa, MBA, PhD, selaku Wakil Direktur Bidang Pendidikan, Penelitian, dan Kemahasiswaan.
Next, we will hear a speech from Mr. Denny Daniel Kesa, MBA, PhD, as the Vice Director of Education, Research, and Student Affairs.
Kepada Bapak Denny, waktu dan tempat kami persilakan.
We extend our invitation to Mr. Denny for his speech.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom Om Swastiastu. Greeting to all of you. Good morning. Thank you very much for such a big, nice event. I think this event is very make some questioning because the topic is very interesting. The archive and cultural heritage, the power of remembering. When I discussed with Louise, Louise is very senior lecturers in Curtin University. Louise Curham is considering on cultural background, and also he have a lot of experience. Today, the students will be studying about archive, not only archive, but the behind of the historical things based on cultural heritage. As we know, Indonesia have a lot of cultural heritage. It consists 1,000 islands, 100 languages, and also many tribes. And also we have comparing to Australia, I think they have also have their own heritage. So we can learn about this with comparative studies. And students will be taking advantage to have some knowledge. And I already discussed with Louise, I think for the futures, we will more engage on collaborations between University of Indonesia, especially Archive Management Report, and Curtin University. And we have here also our distinguished guest from Andri, and also our counterpart from Ministry of Cultures. And so also we have other things to discuss, because for next we have collaboration agreements. We hope in the future we can call Curtin University as sister university, or in Australian culture say mate. Yeah, just like a university mate. Hello mate, it's like that. And we can take more joint research for the lectures. Students can go to Australia, visit Australia to take a lot of programs, just like for maybe student exchange or summer program, but we don't have summer here. So we have called just like special program for the vocational education program. Hopefully, step by step, we can make some collaborations more eager to be becoming, strengthening our collaborations to academic and non-academic things. So our staff also will be learning about these collaborations. And I think Louise will be send message to their college to make more often come to vocational education program. Even we have a lot of things to do, just like engagement letters, something like that. But we're more eager to take the actions, just like have public lectures, also have another community engagement, research, and joint class. Hopefully this event will be fruitful discussions. I thought Louise also will be have time to to answering your questions. And students, do not worry to ask. Even um, our English is not our native language, but I think we have to eager to speak and asking the question to Louise, because this is very rare opportunity. Maybe this time, that's it. I will make up to God this event will be successful. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih kepada Bapak Denny atas sambutannya.
Thank you, Mr. Denny, for your warm welcome.
Berikutnya kita akan memasuki sesi kuliah umum yang akan dimoderatori oleh Ibu Rati Surtikanti M.Hum selaku dosen program studi manajemen rekod dan arsip.
Next, we will enter the public lecture session, which will be moderated by Ms. Rati Surtikanti M.Hum as the lecturer of record and archives management.
Kepada Ibu Rati, waktu dan tempat kami persilahkan.
We invite Ms. Rati to kindly specify the time and place for us.
Thank you. First, we gonna have a photo session with Pak Denny, Pak Budiman, Miss Curham. Okay, we have first maybe some of the guests. Okay, here. Yeah, we. First, allow me to welcome our distinguished speaker, Miss Curham, to come to the stage, please. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I wish you all in the best condition today. Now to make it short. Dear audience, student, I'm Rati Surtikanti, the moderator of today's public lecture. I'm very happy to see you all and welcome you to this lecture. Today's lecture is about archive as cultural heritage and the power of remembering. Our dear audience and students, our speaker today is Dr. Louise Curham. I hope not, because mistake say your name. Let me read some bio of Dr. Louise Curham. Is not right. He's a lecturer in the libraries, sorry, archives, record and information science discipline in the Curtin University High School. Leads teaching in the archives and record area. Joined the tertiary sector in 2020 after 2 decades working in government information, community records, and audiovisual collection. She has held policy and project-based role at the National Archive in Australia and the Australian National Maritime Museum. Also, research focus on objects that elude meaningful digitation. Also, an accredited professional member of the Australian Society of Archives and past council member. So also actively involved in Australian record management community. So anything can ask about that. And the international digital preservation and audiovisual archives communities. So many professional. Okay, let's come. Okay, our beloved, our dear audience and student, our before the presentation begins, I will inform how the presentation will be going. First, Dr. Louise Curham will be invited to present the materials. After that, we will have question answer session, and followed by conclusion. Now allow me to welcome the speaker, Dr. Louise Curham, to deliver a presentation. It's about maybe 30 minutes because it's a very short time. And after that, we're gonna have a session, question answer session. You may start the presentation, please.
Selamat pagi. Terima kasih for the beautiful introduction and the very kind words, and for your beautiful attendance and your effort to wear your yellow jackets and your special clothes on this occasion. I've got my high heels on, which is very unusual for me. So I am really honoured to be here. Wiwit and I have been talking for the best part of a year to make this visit possible. It's my first visit to Indonesia, and it is a beautiful, amazing country. And I am really honoured to get to sing your national anthem with you. So I didn't think that would happen today. So what am I here to talk about? So I had given a subtitle to my talk because from what I've learned from Wiwit, what your focus has been on is about managing current records. It's about the stuff that makes us be able to find, use, and manage our information to make things work more efficiently, to make sure we're not creating risks, to use our digital information in ways that can help us achieve goals of our organisations, and to hold people to account so that they can find stuff to show why they made decisions. What I'm wanting to do is to link what you are learning at the moment to the other side of what records can do, which is when we keep a portion of those records for the long term as archives, they can help us remember who we are, they can help us understand more about our identities, they can help us meet goals that our communities might have, they can help us as a society ground our understanding of where we are. So I have a very eminent archives friend in Australia, who some of you in this audience will know, called Adrian Cunningham. And Adrian has been working tirelessly in the archives field for over 40 years. Adrian and I had a chat the other day about this very kind of rub tummy, pat head at the same time thing that archives do, which is both support business, records, support us to make businesses work efficiently, to help us account for what we did. And in the longer term, they can do this dance of also helping us to build our culture. So that is the kind of shape of what I'm going to talk about. Now I have to work out where I point. Where do I point? Aha. Okay. About me. So I think I've skipped a slide. Let me just check. Okay. How do I go forward? Now I think I've lost the plot. It's just take 1 second while I work out where these slides are going. So if I point this way, will that make it change? Sorry, I should have rehearsed this before. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, the slide that I will start with is the one that talks about my background. That's important because if you have a sense of my credentials, you'll feel more confident that what I've got to say. It's okay. Don't worry, we'll be fine. Yeah, so our colleague very kindly introduced me and explained that I have worked for a long time in industry before joining the university. And that was in government information, the same part that you are currently studying. But I started life in audiovisual collections, and my first training was actually in film. So that cultural heritage dimension has always sat side by side for me, which is proving to be extremely useful when we get to a discussion like today's. So my theme for my talk is archives of memory, but as I said, I'm going to get to this by talking about records. I want to talk about how records move from playing a role in an event between people or people in an organisation, fixing an event in time. So I'm sure you've all got an understanding of that when we make a record, we're actually fixing something in time. We're saying at this moment, send me a message on WhatsApp and I've got that message on my phone. So that transaction happened in that moment in time. So we fix the event, but we can't fix its interpretation, how we might later understand what was going on when Whit and I exchanged that message. And the task that all of you as records people are trying to achieve is to connect that WhatsApp message to that context so that later on we can understand the who, what, where, when of that WhatsApp message. I'm seeing some nodding heads, so I hope that you're understanding me okay. Please interrupt me. I know it's hard to interrupt when someone's actually talking, but if you stick your hand up or send a question on chat, we can do your questions. Okay, so what I want to say here is that interpretation of understanding that message that Whit and I have exchanged is what makes archives so rich. Because over time, in 50 years' time, that relationship between Whit and I may become really significant for the development of archives practice in Jakarta. Who knows? And the thing about those meanings over time is that they don't get exhausted or worn out because we are always in a different time and place. Our interpretation of that information in the future will always look different. Does that make sense? Yeah? Hope so. Okay. But back to the records playing their role in an event. Depending on how valuable we think they are, they then can play a role as archives. So we have a colleague here with us today from ANRI, and ANRI is busily setting aside a portion of the records of the government of Indonesia that are kept as archives. So in Australia, that's a tiny portion. It's about 5% of government information that ends up being archives. That's where a lot of my career in the records world was spent, was making decisions about what should be kept as archives. In Australia, that happens through legal arrangements under our archives legislation. But every country in the world does that differently, and every region does that differently. In Australia, the archives legislation has had some benefits, but it certainly hasn't created the perfect situation where all government agencies do what they should. But it does play a role. My key point here is that there's a small portion of those WhatsApp messages that we and I have exchanged that may be relevant to keep for the very long term as archives. So, what lies at the centre of what I want to share with you is a concept of evidence. So now I am going to try and get my slides to go. Let's just see what happens. Oh, look, I can see it up the back. Okay. All right. Don't worry. You don't need them. It's just a distraction because you'll see my Google Translate of my Bahasa Indonesian. So I think it's actually probably better. Oh no, here we are. Got them again. Let's try again. Okay. All right. So that was the first slide introducing me. This is the second slide. And you can now all have a quiet chuckle to yourselves about what Google had to say about that translation. Okay, so the key point I'm really going to talk about is this business of evidence, okay? Because what links this world of records, of the current record that we're managing for business efficiency, to offset risk, to help us make good decisions. It's evidence, it's qualities of evidence that make that information useful. And we can provide those qualities by the way we attach that who, what, when, where, why to the record. So I'm going to explain that in more detail. But what lies at the centre of what I've got to tell you is this concept of evidence. And it's not just in the sense of a court of law, you know, like it's a piece of evidence because it ended up in court. It connects us to things that have happened, a process that enriches and grounds us. So it enriches us, makes us understand more, grounds us because it helps us know where we are now, helps us understand where we are now. In this conception of records, they take many forms. So in Australia, in native title cases, for example, records can take the form of songs, they can be diaries, emails, social media posts, Super 8 films, all the way through to board meeting minutes and the kind of records you're more familiar with. So I'm going to go into more detail about these twin roles. I'm going to share some observations about why people keep records, and I'm going to share with you how I teach my students about this. And I'm going to conclude by telling you a bit about some of my research. Okay, so as I've said, records do this stuff of playing two roles in society. one supporting government, business, organisations to be efficient and show decisions. The other is to support society's memory by keeping some information long-term as archives. Now, just before I keep going, I want to check that you can actually all hear me comfortably. Yeah, people up the back? Not too loud? Okay, thanks, that's good. All right. What I want to do now is I want to outline this idea of evidence. And I'm hoping you're all going to have this moment of recognition when you go, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I get it. Okay, let's see. You may not. Because things like evidence are actually very cultural. The way I see evidence from my Caucasian Australian background is going to be quite different from the way you might see evidence. So let's see how we line up. So to outline this twin role of supporting memory and supporting accountability, the record lies at the centre. That's what links. Canadian archivist Laura Miller, some of you may have met Laura Miller's writings in your study, and British Caribbean archivist Jeanette Bastian both explain what's so important about archives, and that's that evidence. To get information to behave as evidence, there are properties that need to be looked after. Standards, and by this I mean like internationally agreed standards like ISO 15489, which some of you may be familiar with, identify these properties as reliability, authenticity, integrity, usability. Now, I'm not sure how that's going with the translation there. Let me tell you what I mean by those. So we can say a record is reliable. So, but yeah, these things can seem super abstract. So let me give you an example. So a piece of information is reliable if we can be certain its content is accurate. So notes from a meeting are a good example. So say the WhatsApp message that Wiwit and I have exchanged, it's reliable if what Wiwit reports to me about the meeting she and I just had is accurate, then I'm going to be satisfied that Wiwit is a reliable note taker, that her notes are going to be reliable. I want that quality in my records, that there's a process, a business process that happens consistently that delivers some reliability around the content. So that's things like when the record gets made close to the event. So, for example, notes from a meeting are considered to be a better set of evidence if they're made straight after the meeting than if they're made 3 weeks later, for example. A piece of information is authentic if we can be sure it's what it claims to be. So when we think about that WhatsApp message, there are certain qualities that reassure us it is actually a WhatsApp message and that that is how it was sent and received. And that it was sent by Wiwit to me and my reply went back to her. And we do that by the way that we can understand that documentary format. And we're all so used to looking at WhatsApp messages, we don't even question it. But think of yourself in 50 years' time when WhatsApp is no longer, it's gone the way of X, and it is not something that people are using anymore. How are we going to understand what that system did? How can we be certain that that thing actually is what it is? We want that kind of assurance. And when our information is really, really important, we'll go to a lot of trouble to make sure that that authenticity is there. Integrity is this quality of making sure it's complete, okay, and that it hasn't been changed. So if we sent me a message that had a photo, if I want to consult that as a record in the future, I'm going to want her text and the record. And I'm going to want to be sure that no one has been able to go in and rewrite Wiwit's message in the time that it's been in the custody of the archives. So, and in the time that it's been managed as a record in your organisation. So that's our quality of integrity. So usability is a much more obvious one, and that's us being able to find this thing in such a time that we can actually make use of it. It's no use finding it 3 weeks after the decision has been made. We need to be able to locate it in time to actually use it for a decision. And then we need it to be performable. We need to be able to be sure that we can actually read this thing, the Word document. Can we open it? Can we access it? Okay, so the point here is that some evidence, we want these properties, we really want to spend time and effort to make sure our information is being managed really carefully to deliver this. But that's not the case all the time. There are situations, a situation where we might need that kind of rigour is, for example, around a property dispute, such as a land title. And in Australia, that situation where council records about planning decisions were becoming really impossible to locate led to archives legislation being adopted in New South Wales in order to look after those kind of records. So hopefully you're starting to get a picture that sometimes we're going to go to a lot of trouble to look after our information, but other times we may not. So for example, my manager approving my travel, once the travel's complete, there's really going to be no need to necessarily keep those administrative approval records for a long time. There could be a situation where it becomes really valuable. Can't think of one offhand. It's always going to be a case of it depends to some degree. So in the records world, in the world of current records that you're involved in, we express this as managing information according to risk and managing information according to value. We make decisions about how important the process is to us, and if it's very important, we put a lot of effort into having high quality information and high quality evidence. In the archives world, high quality can align with high value, but not always. And in a business setting, what's really important is that we're wanting to link the performance we need to what our organisation is trying to achieve. A really important message in Australia at the moment is about the dog and the tail, and making sure that the records process is not the tail making the dog wag. So in other words, that the emphasis is on what does the organisation need to achieve, and therefore how to build our information records program to achieve those goals. But there are situations where those links can align. So what's valuable to a business can be what's valuable to the archives in the world of appraisal. So now we're going to, so that's kind of it on the record side, right? So what I want you to understand, let's just make sure that you've grabbed hold of these points, is that what records do is we have the capacity to use them as evidence. And we do that by linking them to their context, and we do that through ensuring they have these qualities of being authentic, having integrity, being reliable, and being usable. Okay, so what I'm wanting you to get is that's what we're trying to do when we're in the current records environment. What I'm now going to show you is that when we're in the archives world, those qualities of evidence might not look the same. There could be lots of stuff we'll keep as archives that might not be so robustly managed in the records environment, but they're still really important for telling us about who we are and where we've come from. So in other words, what we're doing is we're kind of opening up what the relevance of these qualities are and what we think about as evidence. So I said earlier about all the different formats, that this might include social media posts, diary entries. So this kind of gets much further away from business records, but these can reflect what a politician, an artist, a writer, a community leader, a sports club, a not-for-profit group is doing. And these can tell us about that activity that's going on in society. So what I'm wanting you to understand is that this is not a big leap for you because you already understand about evidence, but it's just starting to recognise that that evidence comes from different places in different ways. Okay, so now I go forward one. Okay, so this is the bit where we talk about this evidence as being messy. So I've kind of already shown you that this stuff can be very messy. And the records might not have a whole lot. We may not be able to guarantee that they're complete, that we've got the whole record. We may not be totally sure that actually it really, we may not be able to work out at all what kind of piece of digital object this thing is in 50 years' time. But we may be able to work out who it's come from and what interactions it was involved in. And therefore, we may be able to understand the important role it can play. So we make a decision in this situation based on how this information can shine a light on our culture, on rights and entitlements. So how can it support people, normal people, citizens, to do the things that they want to do? That's not always going to be government information or business information that does that. Our past decisions and actions in our own lives and in the lives of our communities. So every archive expresses this differently, in line with the way every archival endeavour is linked to its community differently. So even as records people prize those qualities of authenticity, reliability, integrity, usability, that's not the end of the story. It's much more, the evidence can be much more messy and haphazard, as I've said. There's a crossover in that list I gave before about flyers for events, performances, social media, etc. around photos, diary entries, social media feeds, email inboxes. So what I'm wanting you to understand is that you already know about some of these formats. So my key point here is that records play these two roles. They can help us manage stuff more efficiently, manage risk, meet requirements under laws, but they can also be evidence in a broader sense, helping individuals and societies to remember and give an opportunity for understanding. So remember I said that we have this potential, we're seeking to capture the story of this WhatsApp message between Wiwit and I, the who, what, when, where, why, in the metadata we capture around it, and the way we organise that around principles of provenance and original order, these archival principles. But we are, it's courses for courses. There may be records we really need where those details are much more sketchy or less precisely attached to the information. So I have told you about Adrian Cunningham, and he and I having a conversation about this two-step thing that records do, which is provide accountability and provide memory. Adrian is really actively involved in the Memory of the World program, so there we are, accountability and heritage. So he is really involved in this project called Documenting Australian Society. Indonesia is part of the Memory of the World Register. There are several items, treasured items that are on that register. Adrian is working on the Australian subcommittee on a project trying to work out the problem that the emphasis on government information in the archives world and the emphasis on business information means that it's a one-sided story about society. I'm sharing this with you because I want you to recognise that this is new in Australia as well, in terms of trying to create a more holistic picture of our society. Some countries, like Canada, for example, has had a tradition of a broad remit of documenting its society and culture through its archives and collections, and it joins its archives and its national library together to bring all the unpublished materials in one place, one institution. That's not the case in Australia. It's not the case in many countries don't do it that way. What Adrian's trying to do with this project is to find the places in the community where he's trying to find who is not there, who is not present, and how we make it present. So why is that so important? It's important for lots of reasons, and the main argument for this comes from the galleries and museums sector. And it's because with the power, the expectations of society have over the last 20 years been focused on people's identities and on the participation of citizens in their society. And so making sure people are actually in our collections is really important if we're going to be successful in arguing with governments to say the work that we do is really important because we represent our whole society. And at the moment, with a bit of analysis, the picture is actually quite lopsided. The voices of government, the voices of business, the voices of certain sectors of society are much more strongly reflected than others. So Adrian has been doing projects like actively collecting records about the experience of COVID-19. And he's been running discussions with different groups to try to understand this. Of course, there are many community archiving initiatives in Australia, but this area is not mature. So I'm just wanting you to be aware that this kind of concept of seeking to find a way to bring the presence of the breadth of society into public collections and public institutions is an active area of engagement in Australia. So before I get on to the next bit, I just need to return to this messy component one more time. So I mentioned Laura Miller and Jeanette Bastian, two writers on archives in English. A point that they make is really clear about this question of the different formats the record can take. And I gave earlier, I just want to reiterate I gave the example of native title cases where evidence in a wide variety of formats from oral testimony to artworks and accounts of other cultural practices is involved. Also in heritage, intangible heritage. So this is things like song, dance, and the like, is now well recognised. For example, it's in UNESCO documents to support keeping and caring for intangible heritage. But for the most part, in practice, in cultural collections, it's still that intangible knowledge still needs to get transformed into physical entities, such as a recording or an inscription, so that they can come into a collection. So my own research looks quite actively at that. But what I want you to take from this is that what's important is to take account that what we can expect our archives to be is messy in lots of formats, and for some of those formats to look nothing like the kinds of handwritten documents we might associate with colonial archives, for example. Okay, so we've got these twin roles. Who carries them out? is there a divide between archivists and records managers, and does it? So this is me projecting you into a future where you're part of this practice. There have been different approaches over time by archivists and records managers to sharing these tasks. Sometimes lines have been drawn and archivists have looked after old records and records managers have looked after current ones. Since computers were introduced in Australia, archival thinking has been applied to managing current records, and this has been to make sure that archivists can be advocates for looking after the records that need to be kept as archives. The thinking here is that in the fragile environment of computers, early intervention by archivists working with or as records managers was crucial, otherwise archives would be lost. Another concept here, around this time in the 90s, a humble archivist from Melbourne, Frank Upwood, joined one of the universities. And he was thinking about this problem of computers and records. And Upwood developed a model for archives that recognised records could behave in different ways over time. So this is called the records continuum, which is something that Australian archives theory is very proud of. Australian archivists think this is a really great model that the Australian archives tradition has come up with. And what it does in the records continuum is instead of it being a life cycle line where we've got the active current record and we deal with it, we sentence it and we deal with it, and then we send it off to the archives if it's high value enough at the end of its life. In Frank's model, what he does is join them together in these circles where we recognise that the relationship between the point when we create the record and the people who might want to use that record for purposes quite different from what the record got created for can happen at any point in that record's life cycle, in the life of that record. And so his continuum brings these ideas much closer together. So that has quite far-reaching consequences because what it does is make archivists and records people become really conscious of the people who are in the records. And that's another key theme in Australian practice at the moment, is thinking really hard about what it's like if you're the person who's the subject of that record, you never even knew the thing got created and it's all about you. And you might stumble across it, or you might actively go looking for it, but it might tell you a story about you that is not at all how you would have chosen to represent yourself or that situation. So this concept of person-centered record of trying to give agency, a fancy word that really means give people a say in what actually happens to information, is all part of this links to these ideas about participation in building collections. This is about participation in business of actually making records. So that connects with archives because it really affects things like description. So for our colleagues who are here today who manage big collections, this challenge of working out how to make records accessible and intelligible to communities who may not even know they exist, but who are very much in and of the record, is something that Australian collection managers are really thinking a lot about. And this gets expressed in things like right of reply to records. So for the social justice warriors sitting in this room, this all gets very interesting at this point because it's a lot about the way records do active work in society. Right. Okay. So then the next thing I want to say now, records get kept. Why do we keep them? Okay, so as I said, I've let you all know that appraisal, the step in the records business, which is the business of selecting the records, is one of the, I'm quite biased because I worked in this area for a long time. And if you ask people like me, we will say, oh, that's hands down the most important part of record keeping, is deciding what should be kept for the long term. You know, that's kind of the pay dirt moment. So legislation is one factor in what we decide to keep. So in Australia, our archival authorities have laws that require government records to be kept, including archives. And of course, that's the same in business. You know, there are business requirements, and different industries and sectors have different requirements around legal requirements that certain records are kept. But as I said, the records community in Australia is putting its emphasis on bigger organisational goals than compliance. So I mentioned the dog and the tail, and that we don't want the records management. We're not doing records management for its own sake. We're doing it to meet organisational needs. One of the benefits for having this awareness of this cultural heritage dimension is that the records people can be advocates for this information from the beginning as archives. So when things are high value and we know they're going to be kept for the long term, if we can understand that from the beginning, we can manage our information. We can build that in as a business need of that information. And that is really quite a focus for Australia, along with working out how we can be effective to meet the needs of the organisations we're in. Okay, so that concludes that component of what I want to talk about. Hang on, I've got one more slide, sorry. My notes are finished there, but I keep going. So I just want to talk you through this. This is an important one for me. This is a model that I've been using with my students for quite some time. It originally comes from a quite eminent Australian archivist called Sigrid McCausland, who tragically died in about 2016. And Sigrid had this idea of these forces that shape record keeping. And I've come to think of these as the forces that shape archives because they're part of that record keeping environment. So Sigrid's four were legislation, policy, standards, and funding. So that will not be, you'll recognise those. So that's the law, what the law says we have to do. Policy, that's what the local rules might be. So ANRI, for example, possibly sets some rules around what government agencies have to do. Standards, that's things like the international community deciding to issue an international standards organisation standard, and there are several of those. Funding, so that's us being successful in arguing why this matters. Why do we need records? How can they help transparency and accountability? How can they help social memory? The other ones that I add in is about standpoint and community expectation and motivation. So I want to just draw your attention in particular to community expectation and motivation. So this is what I was saying about expectation that underpins the work that Adrian Cunningham is doing, for example, with Memory of the World. Because there's an expectation amongst the public that their public institutions are for them. They want to see themselves reflected in an organisation like their archives. Or they want the opportunity to develop their own. So this community expectation motivation is really an important one. And I call it both expectation and motivation because the motivation is when the community gets together and decides to do its own work with its archives. And so it's a really important force in actually shaping that endeavour. Standpoint is one that's more concerned with recognising what you as the archivist bring. So this has quite a long theoretical lineage, which is all about the archivist as the gatekeeper. So I explained that I love appraisal, that I've been involved in the selection of archives for a long time. And I'm interested in that because it's like being a curator in a museum. You're the person who gets involved in those decisions. But of course, if you play that role, you are a gatekeeper. You're the person making those decisions. And the argument from the archives field around administrative records, like government records, is that they accumulate through the course of business. And in that process of accumulation, the business just does what it does, accumulates records. There's not a conscious decision about what gets kept and doesn't. The reality is, of course, there are conscious decisions. And in Australia in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of problems with that in governments all around the country because a culture has emerged of people not wanting to make records, not wanting to document their actions, which is a real challenge. And it has consequences for democratic processes. So that gatekeeper argument, that natural accumulation concept of the records just accumulating has been really kind of dismissed by the archives field over the last 40 years, so that we've evolved our understanding to recognise the power in that position that the people who control the records have. That requires us to develop self-reflection, to be able to recognise the biases we might bring and the perspectives we might bring to that record-keeping initiative. Of course, there's great limits to what you can do. It's like talking to people, computer scientists, about AI and ethics. They'll say, hey, but you want the AI to work. So, you know, if you put ethics in it, then it probably won't work. So it's a complex question. But the point is that standpoint is about noting where you sit as you make decisions about collections that are going to impact many other people than just you. Okay, so I think that concludes more on what causes some archives. No, I've spoken about that. Okay, so now we're moving into section 3. Okay, so this is a 3-act deal. I should really have a big black slide in the middle, which I thought I did have. So this is where I'm going to pretend you're my students. And I'm going to sort of show you how I go about teaching this to my students. So the challenge of this twin role, when people are brand new to this field, so see if you can remember back, maybe earlier this year or last year when you were really, really new. I'm sure for many of you, when you were 5, when you were little children, you never thought, I doubt many of you thought, I'm going to be a records manager when I grow up, right? It's not a very common ambition for people to sort of identify. And so the challenge of trying to introduce people to this double act that records do can be quite complex because they meet records through that accountability side and they don't really think about the old stuff, or they just think it's the old stuff. And they don't necessarily see a link between the practice that's going on with the current record and what's going to become archives in the future. So how do I go about sharing this with my students? So I use archival principles. So, and this gets complicated because archival principles are being really challenged at the moment. So I just gave you an example of the gatekeeper archivist, the neutral archivist, as one of those challenges. But here are the key things. So if you take nothing else from today's talk, this is the thing I really want you to take. Okay? So this is archives have integrity. So what does that mean? That means that they are connected to each other. So I explained, we've looked at an individual case of that integrity, which was our WhatsApp message with the photo and the text, and we need both bits. When I'm saying archives have integrity, what I mean is that a set of records that get brought in about one of the professors at UI that goes into the UI archives We want that whole, we want the organic whole of that professor's records. Why do we want that? We want that because if we just have the granular pieces of information on their own, they're not going to tell us much about themselves at all. There could be one or two individual documents in that set of records that are meaningful, but taken as a whole is when archives become important. When I'm teaching my students, a lot of them come from libraries, and my challenge is to try to explain to them that this is really different from a book. Because when you've got a book, that individual book can stand on its own. But when you've got an archive, you need the whole organic thing. And you're trying to create that context so the next person who gets out the record can imagine they open the filing cabinet in that professor's office and they've got to have it. Okay. So the tradition of original order and provenance. So those are two principles in Australian archives teaching that we really go on about a lot and we think of as being our core tenets. That we need to know the who, that we're seeking to identify who was the agent in this record creating process, and that's how we organise our records. Original order, that it's important to try to show that organic whole by not reorganising those papers, by trying to keep them in the order they collated in. So that goes back to that idea of the neutral archivist lying everything, letting everything sift through. Those ideas are really under attack, right? So that idea of provenance, as I said, when we think about person-centred records, when we think about the people who are actually in the record, we really create a gap if we just focus on the person that made the record. We need to give them more. We need to talk about who's in the records as well as who's made the record. So this is emerging practice. You may not have ever thought about these things before, right? And that issue of original order, in that concept of the neutral archivist, that's really great. But of course, for many collections, particularly community collections, they've just all been stuffed in a box and there is no order. They just are a bunch of stuff through which we need to try to find a way of explaining to our users what this is all about and why it's worth their time and attention. So I've given you the problems with those traditions. So I hope this is making sense. I'm worried I might be losing you a bit. Anyway, you can ask me questions. You haven't fallen asleep. Okay. Right. What was that? 5 minutes. Okay. Oh, my goodness. They do this slide. Okay. So, introductory week, distinctions between published and unpublished materials, putting information in context. So, I've told you these already. And I've told you about attaching the who, what, when, where, why to records. So, that's where I start with my students. Then I'm moving into, okay, so how are we different? So I look at the museum sector and I look at the library sector and I identify how we're different. And it's through integrity. Some of you will have met this concept of GLAM, Galleries, Libraries, Archives and Museums, the four sisters of GLAM, as my colleague Yasa calls it. I have a look at that because this is about our colleagues who manage collections in other places, in museums, in art galleries, in libraries. They're also managing collections, just in slightly different ways. So then I bring in these key issues. So I've talked to you about most of these already. So what I haven't talked about, identity and participation I've talked a little bit about decolonising when I've talked about the fact that the records can reflect just one point of view. And that whole argument about decolonising is about reflecting multiple views. One of the ones, and the same with archives and power. So this is just recognising how powerful archives are, and that's Schwartz. One of the things I haven't talked to you about that's very relevant for you is sustainability in archives. What can they offer? So I have quite a bit of work that I've been doing. So this is the topic I'm up to with them this week. And what I've been talking, I've made a recording of them on Monday, which was talking about this distinction between the neutral archivist that I just talked you through before. And this isn't a topic about use and users. So then I'm going to lead to collection policy. So, and this also connects with law, with for example, archives legislation. And here I'm talking to them about, okay, so actually, who is this collection? Let's have a really good look at who this is for. So this is my diagram showing them these processes in managing a collection. And I'm at the stakeholders bit where I'm talking about who is it for. And then I'm getting into this analysis of who those users are. I've talked to you already about this, about rights and entitlement, cultural expression. And I'm recognising that there are people who work with collections, there's people who fund the collections, the community closely associated with it, and then other users. And there's also our wider profession that's playing a role. And then I'm taking a close look at what goes into a policy. So I'm trying to give them some practical tips on actually how to go about this business, building a collection. And then I go through examples of actually what I'm doing. And here I'm going through some of the literature to tell them what's going on, and some more examples. And looking at how National Archives does this business. So the next bit that I was going to go into was to set out how our school works. I don't think that you need to really know about this. I will talk this through with the lecturers in the school and others in the community who might want to know this detail. It's not so relevant for you as students. Then I want to just really briefly give you a taste of what's in my research. So what am I looking at? This is a project about audiovisual histories. So the Southeast Asia Pacific Audiovisual Archiving Association is one of the really dynamic groups of people, forums in our region, in your region. And I gave a very short talk for a poster session this year, which was talking about this form of early media art that I'm particularly interested in. I'm interested in that because I am looking at the question of how to archive experience. So I talked to you about intangible heritage, songs, dance. This stuff that I'm interested in is like that. It's like old film projectors and performers doing stuff live in the 1970s. And I'm wanting to explore those traditions in your part of the world, here in Indonesia, and I'm also interested in looking into that in Thailand and in the Philippines and in the regional world. I'm also doing this work on climate change and sustainability, thinking about what archives do there. And that's about a digital mapping community building project in my community. And then in this archiving scenes, I've got this project focused on long storage. What happens if we keep collections for 1,000 years? So DNA technology is coming as a storage tool, synthetic DNA, and I'm working on a project looking at that. So this is my group of collaborators. There's the capsule of DNA that Raja, our colleague on the bottom left, is holding. So that one's pretty fun. And this is the work, these 16mm live film performances that I'm really interested in archiving, that I've been with. So really that is going to conclude this whirlwind tour. So what do I really want you to take away? I want you to understand this idea of the twins. I think you will have really got that we're accountability and we're heritage, that you recognise this already because you know about evidence. Evidence can look different when we're talking about social memory, the kind of forms that evidence can take. But when you really start thinking about what gets used as business evidence, you start to recognise that it's already very, very broad. So what I'm wanting you to do is have this moment of going, yeah, okay, I kind of get this. I already know about this, but I can see how this is going to be different. I also want you to take on board that slide about the forces that shape, to remember that we've got these forces that actually shape how collections come together, because that is a really useful one for you to remember. So that really concludes this for me. I really hope that I've said something useful and relevant for you. I'm a bit worried I may have gone too theoretical, but let's see how it went. You can ask me questions. Okay.
Thank you very much for giving us a very interesting and informative presentation. Maybe. Okay, dear audience and students, now we come to the question and answer session. You may raise your hand and introduce yourself first. Okay, name and institution. Okay, maybe we can start with left side. Is there any question? Oke, kalau kita ingat mungkin ya kalau di Indonesia itu profesionalnya archivaris, jadi nggak ada beda mengerjakan record and archives ya. Mungkin itu bisa ditanyakan kebijakannya gimana nih kalau di Australia kan. Kemudian tadi kita bicara bahwa ada policy atau aturan yang memastikan bahwa record yang diciptakan itu akan menjadi archive kalau dia memang punya nilai yang berguna untuk community. Tapi kalau di Indonesia ada aturan ya arsip terjaga, arsip negara, mungkin kalau yang sudah kuliah sampai ke situ nih gitu kan. Jadi bisa ditanyakan nih kalau di Australia gimana gitu aturannya, apakah benar-benar. Kemudian apakah tadi kalau ada ASN nggak ya di Australia gitu. Kalau ASN kan arsiparis fungsionalnya dia akan mengerjakan dua-dua ya, either ya records or archives gitu kan. Tadi kan kayaknya memang benar-benar how to make sure that a record become archives, how to manage them, how to guide them supaya dia tetap bisa dijaga gitu ya. Kalau kita kan karena kalau di ASN ya dia nangani langsung ya archivaris itu ya record manager ya archivis. Okay, maybe there's a question or from chat. Belum ada. Okay, maybe Bu Wiwit or Bu Rizkina or Pak Sofwan, there's any question about this student? Okay.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Ahmad Sofwan. I would like to ask you that in Indonesia, the archives start in Indonesia and also in particularly in Dutch because Indonesia were Dutch colonized. Particularly for students who want to learn history, they also need to learn Dutch language because the archive not located in Indonesia only, but also in Dutch as the country which colonized Indonesia for 350 years ago. The question is, how about the archive in Australia? Are there have stored in other country, maybe in England, because the close relation between Australia and England, and how to manage that archive as nation memory.
Yeah,
okay.
I think hope I've got this right. So you're kind of asking me like, what's the consequences when the archive is both broken up, yeah, like taken not necessarily here, in lots of different places, yeah. So I'm really glad you brought that up because I think as this challenges, right? So one of the big differences for us between Indonesia, for students here at Vokasi UI and students at Curtin, is that in Australia, the funding for the public institutions is more. But at the grassroots level, there's less. So in discussion about the situation in Indonesia and in my preparation, there are some really big things in favour for Indonesia in developing in this area. And those are to do with very vibrant visual arts, like very active, very visible international arts community, and also very active local heritage keeping through things like the Taman Batam. Yeah, so Australia doesn't have that. In terms of our colonial legacies, which I think is what you're really asking about, is that right? Yeah. So I'm really glad you brought it up because I was a bit nervous too. So for Australia, the colonial legacy isn't so much a problem that the records are in the UK. That is a big issue for Australia around museum objects. So there's a lot of museum objects that are, for example, in the British Museum that people would really, really like to have in Australia. So Joseph Banks and James Cook took a lot of loot and it's never been given back. So there's a lot of discussion around that. It's less of an issue around archives. The challenge for us is that one that I was getting at around provenance, the fact that archives traditionally get organised by who made the record with not taking into account at all the people who are in the record. So for Indigenous people in Australia, that's a real bugbear because, of course, those records really are often about them or are very useful to them, and yet that concept of provenance just says these are the Colonial Secretary's Office records. So, so like this case with the East India Company records here, you know, they're not the, yeah. So I think Indonesia has a really interesting opportunity to, you know, have that dialogue about what archives could, you know, where that could go. I'm really glad you're asking the question because I think it's one that needs a lot of discussion from people not like me who don't really understand the issues. And of course, I'm conscious that there have already been efforts, you know, to bring records to Jakarta, but how effective that is sounds like a question. So I guess that one of those references I had up there was about archives and power. And for me, that's what this question is all about. And that's why that is a really interesting thing, that area, questioning that concept of provenance and how to extend ideas of provenance, which is really not that difficult, especially in the digital. You know, it's just capturing more people associated with those things. Yeah. So I hope that's helpful. Sort of. Yeah.
Thank you.
Students, did one of you want to? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Don't be shy, everyone. Just ask them. I'm not going to stand on my dignity. No question is too small.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiara. I'm from Record and Archives Management of Operational Program in Universitas Indonesia. First of all, I would like to say thank you, Dr. Louise, for coming to National Program of Universitas Indonesia. And after everything that you tell us about record, archives, and cultural heritage, I would like to ask, do you think is there any challenges that we face in preserving archives as cultural heritage nowadays? That's it. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I'll sit, shall I? Okay, let's sit. So my answer would be preservation. So I'm quite wedded to the view. So I've told you that I think appraisal is really important. So the other there's three crucial other things that archivists have to do. One of them is to describe stuff. The other one is to control access. And the third one is to preserve things. So when we're talking preservation, obviously in your environment, because of the environmental conditions in Indonesia, the opportunity to just put things on the shelf and hope they'll still be there in 50 years' time is limited. So those challenges are super real. And I'm sure for the people who are sitting here in the room who manage collections, a lot of your effort gets spent on explaining why it's so important to create environmental conditions that can support extending the life of records. This is a focus area. I had the good fortune last year to go along to Sabika, which is the Southeast Asian branch of the International Council on Archives conference, which was all about sustainability and archives. And there was lots of presentations about the challenges that climate change is going to bring. And there were also lots of presentations on the carbon footprint of preservation. So for example, digital preservation is a really carbon heavy business because of all the computer storage that's involved. And so this leads to things like focusing on selection really carefully so that deciding what you're going to keep is really worth the investment and sacrifice that society is going to make in order to keep those items. So that was one of the lessons from those talks. The other one was that there's a real movement in the conservation profession, the experts who deal with preservation, to try to explore whether the traditional thinking around environmental conditions are actually necessary all the time. In other words, do we need to have 18 degrees and 50% relative humidity? What happens if we just have 25 degrees and 70% humidity? What would the impact be? So that is really important to keep an eye on, because of course here in Jakarta, it's really obvious, in Depok, it's really obvious to me there are many social pressures and cultural heritage is not super high on the list. So if we're going to be effective in getting things done, we need to find ways to be able to do things that are light and small and actually achieve things. Digital preservation is one of the favourite subjects I teach. That was something I should have shared with you actually, is actually what subjects are in our course. I will share that with the teachers so you can follow that up if you want to know more. That digital preservation one I really love because it is one where really simple solutions can be found that will still extend the life of those objects. In short, digital preservation just means making a copy of the digital stuff you care about and doing everything you can to make it as discoverable as possible, so titling it and organising it so that you can try to keep some of that all-important context around it. So I hope that that's helpful. I'm basically saying it's a problem, it's a particular problem here. The whole community across Southeast Asia is thinking about sustainability and preservation, and the conservation profession is working actively on it. Thank you for the question. Yeah. Well,
Check. Okay. Good. I have one question. Good afternoon, everyone, and Dr. Louise Curham. First of all, thank you very much for your explanation, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Very cool, and I have one question. Unequal access to archive and reinforce social inequalities in society. Groups or individuals who have greater access to historical information and resources may strengthen their position, while others may be marginalized. The question is, what is the impact of unequal access to archive on social justice and historical research? Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. That's a great question. So just to make sure I've got it right, you're asking what are the consequences of inequality in the archive for historical research? Yeah, I see you nodding. Okay, so where have I heard people talking about this? So digital humanities is a field that talks about this a lot. I also hear this discussed in internet studies. So my school at Curtin has, as part of the school, the internet studies group who teach this course called digital media, digital something. Can't remember what. But anyway, these two fields are really thinking about these questions of what happens when our digital heritage is uneven, has big gaps in it. Because what it means is that certain people are just not there and certain positions, certain viewpoints are not there. So that is why projects like Adrian Cunningham's, which has problems because he's coming from a very particular place and relationship to archives, but his intention, and it's not just his intention, it comes from others in the profession in Australia, to seek to do something about those gaps is seems to me a useful one. So I guess a place to keep your eye on is digital humanities. So if you haven't heard about digital humanities before, which some of you may not have, that is a discipline that crosses over between history, archives, cultural studies. The other reason it's really useful you bring this up is because something you need to know about archives is that records people definitely do not own this space. We like to think that archivists are really kind of, it's our area, it's our valley, it's our turf. But the truth of the matter is that over the last 20 years, many disciplines have gotten really super interested in archives. Contemporary art's a really good example. You would expect that history has always been interested in archives, and it has and it hasn't. Once history got wind of the fact that archives are often captives of governments and entrenched positions, historians got very interested in finding alternative sources than those traditional archives, or trying to reread those archives in interesting ways. And one of the scholars I want to bring up in relation to the Indonesian colonial archives is Anne-Laura Stoller, who's the American anthropologist who basically spent her whole career researching those VOC records. And she has a beautiful book called Along the Archival Brain, which is about reading archives holistically in order to discover their silences. So that would be the other part of my response to this particular question, is that silences can also speak. What is not in the archive can be as eloquent as what is there, and there has been lots of scholarship on the ways that those gaps tell us a lot about society through what is not explicitly stated. So that's that whole thing about can't exhaust the archives. The meaning keeps developing as we develop. So have I covered? Is that enough? More? No? Good? Okay. Great.
We can ask. Uh,
Yang mana?
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I ask my question, welcome to the University of Indonesia, Miss Louise Curham, and thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. So, my question is, in Indonesia, we have to become archivists with the condition that we also have to be a civil servant. Does Australia also make the same system as Indonesia? If not, what are the requirements to become an archivist in Australia?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. So the way I'm interpreting, just to check in that I've got this right, you're asking what are the requirements in Australia to become an archivist? Yeah, okay. So the courses that I teach are accredited by our professional associations, and one of those is the Australian Society of Archivists. To become the profession is undecided about whether it is going to require people to have a qualification to get to call themselves an archivist. At the moment, they do have that requirement. The situation in Australia is that the profession is quite small, and the number of jobs that have the title archivist in them is quite small. Most of those jobs are in school archives, private schools that will pay to have someone to look after their heritage. The other, I mean, of course, the universities, there are jobs called archivists. So I'm not completely giving you the right picture there, but what I'm getting at is it's not a huge field. So the Archives Professional Association conference is on right now, today and yesterday, and there will be about 300 delegates at that conference. So it's not a huge group of people, and the profession is really having a deep look at itself to think about what kind of qualifications it wants people to have. Often people stumble into these roles. What I see from a teaching side is that people seek out a qualification because they want to join our field and they're really intrigued and interested. And I feel their effort to get qualified should be recognised. Historically, archivists have been considered clever clogs, to use a Pepper the Pig phrase. So qualification, education has always been considered really important for archivists. There is a tension there in Australia between the archivists and the records managers. So that's where we get into some of the practical and complex issues that come up in this twin mission of accountability and cultural heritage. So I hope that gives you a bit of insight. It's not a very clear-cut answer. Yeah. Not so much. Records managers, so our courses is accredited by the records managers as well, but that's a bit more complex in terms of the expectation. My sales pitch to you is I hope what you've seen from what I've shared with you is that this environment is quite complex. There's a lot to think about. There are a lot of consequences from building a collection. And to build a collection and get public support to fund it, as those of you who work in public collections who are here understand, is a very kind of delicate balancing act between both pushing forward social agendas that the community wants, but also respecting the authority and power of those who are of governments who have the money. So it is a complex task, and I think it's one where the effort to get an education about why it's complex will set you in really good stead. So to explore these kinds of issues around, you know, loot, decolonisation, repatriation, people-centred records, understanding stakeholders, knowing how to make decisions about value and what's at stake in those decisions is really interesting and complex. And I imagine particularly complex here in Indonesia. So I hope that's helpful. Okay.
Thank you for the question and the answer. Maybe because of the time, Buwit, what one more question or okay? This
Terima kasih. Perkenalkan, saya Sarwenda Puspita Dewi dari program Magister Ilmu Perpustakaan. I have one question. How is the role of the computer as a fragile tool in storing or keeping the archives? And how is the policy that is taken by the Austrian government to overcome this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So here I can draw on my experience at National Archives. So I am in that strange place where it's now nearly 5 years since I worked there, but I was actively involved in the policies in the government information management team to seek to address the challenges of digital information. So the way that has been dealt with in the Australian government is been the first tranche of policy was in about 2012, and that was the digital transformation agenda across the whole of government. And as a result of that mandate which really followed actually UK government, which had done this process of recognising that government services could be delivered online and that would be better for citizens. And in order to deliver those services, it was a whole transformation of government practice that needed to happen. So the National Archives got involved in that through policy to, first of all, guide agencies on starting to transition their work processes from paper practices to digital practices. And that was around the real nuts and bolts of the records they produced that at that time were often in paper that got put in boxes. And so there's been several policies that are all still accessible on the National Archives website. So the first of those was the digital transformation policy. Then there was a digital continuity policy. And then there's been building trust in the public record. So those have been, the first policy was actually a policy of the Australian government through cabinet, so a very high level policy that every government department can follow. And the National Archives was very proud of that achievement to get that. The other two policies have been National Archives policy, so not issued by the Australian government, just issued by the National Archives, with the expectation that agencies will do what the Archives is saying. The other thing the Archives has done is had a process to measure performance related to that policy. and that's through their surveys called Checkup. So those, again, you can read about those on the National Archives website. And what they do is measure performance on a bunch of different indicators. So, and there's been Checkup Digital, and there's been Checkup 2.0, and now I think it's just called Checkup this time around. So those are capability maturity models that show both guide agencies on what they should be doing, but also let agencies show where they're up to. So the other thing I want to say there is that what really underpins that is actually the Open Government Partnership, which is an international agenda that started with the GFC, what do we call the GFC? Great Financial Crisis, I've forgotten. Global financial crisis. And that actually began in Greece, I think Greece, US, and UK, maybe Canada too. And Australia was quite a late signatory to the Open Government Partnership, and that first digital transformation policy was one of its commitments. So the Open Government Partnership is a really useful tool for helping governments recognise that this is an international goal to improve transparency and accountability, to lift performance across government all around the world. So that Open Government Partnership aspect could be very important to kind of be aware of. Australia did nothing about the Open Government Partnership for quite some time over the last 5 years. The Australian government this year reaffirmed commitment to the Open Government Partnership. Okay.
About it. Is it anything
Good.
you want to add?
Yeah.
More?
Anything more?
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Curham and sorry. Okay, this is the last question from Zoom. Considering the time, maybe this is the last question. So we have to close this discussion. Okay, dear Miss Curham, I would like to ask about the importance of archive as evidence, as no archives can be evidence for cases and history, but some of them included some controversial and sensitive information. I would like to know your perspective about what our public transparency for information that includes the history of their nation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So it connects with where we started when we're talking about kind of displaced archives, things that are not accessible to the communities who are involved in them. And when I just said about how it's important and education helps us with these kinds of questions, more than that, my slide that talked about the forces that shape record keeping talked about policy and standards. Behaviour in the sector is really, really helpful for archivists to work their way through these kinds of questions. So recognising what are the norms in our sector. So how do other countries, how do other nations deal with this? Are there other nations who face similar challenges to us, and how do they deal with them? So for example, in Australia, there's a lot of dialogue between Australia, Canada and New Zealand, because our relationship between our colonial histories and our First Nations populations, we have some common challenges. So there are quite specific pieces of legislation in Australia that deal with this for government records. There's law. So the Archives Act spells out what the access arrangements have to be for archives in the National Archives. There is still subjective decisions that individuals have to make, and some of you might have heard about the High Court challenge to the decision not to release papers from the Crown, the British Crown, related to the dismissal of our Governor General in the 1970s, of our Prime Minister in the 1970s. So these controversial decisions happen. The other thing is there is privacy legislation in Australia that protects personal information, and that for archivists outside of government, understanding those legislative requirements is important. I had a slide there that I rushed through about developing policy for collecting archives, for community archives and archives like university archives. And it's in that policy that statements about what the access arrangements might be can be made. And then usual practice in Australia is that when items get acquired, for example, by a university, there will be arrangements made with that donor or the person who's the means by which you get those records on what the access arrangements will be. But it is one of the most challenging areas for archivists to deal with. And I think as we're all becoming aware from this world economy that is fueled by personal data, it's actually a question that every sector of the economy is paying attention to right now. So the short answer is standards and policy really matter in this area, and understanding what the legal requirements are, if there are any. So you're not on your own. It's never a decision you make on your own. It's always a decision you make in consultation with others, especially around controversial material. And it's also important to recognise that public institutions have to get public money. So often the compromise is greater than individuals may wish to make. But the truth of the matter is that if we want to have these cultural institutions, we do have to take into account community expectation more broadly. So it's a responsibility to be that has to be taken very seriously, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Curham. Thank you for the question from Numi, participant from Zoom. Okay. Dear participant and student, we finally came to the lecturer. I'd like to give big thanks for the speaker for the very interesting and informative presentation, and for all the participation, we give very active participation. Now we finally give the big applause for speaker and for you all. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih.
Proceed to the seat.
Terima kasih, everyone. And please ask questions. Come along on Friday if you're free and ask questions. And you can ask questions, contact me and I can answer your questions.
Baik, kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada Profesor Louise Curham selaku pembicara dan Ibu Ratih selaku moderator.
We would like to say thank you to Ms. Rati, who has moderated today's public lecture, and Professor Louise. Next is the session of the bestowal of mementos to Professor Louise Curham by Ms. Dia Savitri as the Secretary of the program.
Berikutnya adalah penyerahan sesi cenderamata kepada Profesor Louise Curham oleh Ibu Dia selaku Sekretariat Program, dan kami persilakan untuk mendokumentasikan penyerahan cenderamata. Tidak terasa kita sudah ada di penghujung kuliah umum hari ini.
It is hard to believe that we have reached the end of today's public lecture.
Kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada Profesor Louise Curham yang sudah berkenan mengisi kuliah umum pada hari ini.
We would like to express our gratitude to Professor Louise Curham for graciously delivering the public lecture today.
Dan kami juga mengucapkan terima kasih kepada para hadirin yang sudah hadir baik di auditorium maupun melewati platform Zoom.
And we would also like to thank all the attendees who have been present both in the auditorium and via Zoom platform.
Demikian rangkaian acara hari ini. Semoga kuliah umum yang dilaksanakan hari ini dapat membawa manfaat bagi kita semua.
Thus concludes today's event, hoping that the public lecture held today can be beneficial for all of us.
Saya Fadilah Kemala
dan saya Tristantira Kaladin Dadin.
Selaku MC, mohon maaf jika ada kesalahan kata ataupun perbuatan dari kami yang kurang berkenan.
I, Tristantira Kaladin Dadin,
and I, Fadilah Kemala,
as the MCs, apologize if there were any offending words or action.
Sekian dari kami.
That is all from us.
Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bagi audiens, setelah ini kita akan ada sesi dokumentasi bersama Profesor Louise Curham. Jadi boleh sesi dokumentasi. Ada. Kepada para tamu undangan, mohon nanti jangan langsung pulang karena ada sesi dokumentasi bersama Profesor Louise Curham.